What if I told you that a single vintage suit or individual piece of clothing could be worth $1,000, even thousands of dollars? That's right, and that's exactly why Broadway and major motion picture studios and Hollywood stars all come to me for their vintage clothing. Today, I'm revealing the secrets that costume designers, vintage collectors, and vintage clothing lovers in general need to know in order to unlock the true potential and the value of the vintage clothing items. I'm going to be covering fashion from the 1930s, 20s, all the way up to the 1970s, and we might even touch a little bit on the 1980s, even though I guess technically the 80s and the 90s are vintage now. Even the 2000s are considered vintage. But personally, being in this game for as long as I have, I consider true vintage to be from about the 1920s up to maybe the 1980s at the very latest.
Check my clientele, A-list, nothing less. From runway models to the Hollywood press. Demand so high, consider it a SOS.
If this is your first time here, my name is Phil Jones, also known as the King of Thrift. Normally what I teach on this channel is how to get started reselling or how to take your reselling journey to that next level. But today we're going to be diving into something very particular, something very near and dear to my heart, and that is men's vintage fashion. Now, I've been doing this for 20 plus years. Now, back in the day when I started back in 2000, I didn't sell men's clothing. I sold everything else. And the reason I didn't sell men's clothing back in the day was because, in case you don't know, clothing is the most difficult thing to sell for a profit. Now, you can sell clothing, but making a profit, that's another story. So the reason I was not into that particular aspect of reselling was because it's very difficult to find clothing at a good enough deal in the quantities and the qualities and the desirable styles and fashions, as well as sizes go into that, guys, and condition that you can sell it, that you can buy it at a good enough price, and you can sell it at a good enough price in order to not just make a profit, but to make a good living at. So when I started back in the day, like I said, 20 plus years ago, I sold vintage electronics. I sold lamps. I sold a lot of kitchen appliances back in the day, a lot of George Foreman grills. I sold furniture. I sold armoires, Like I said, I sold everything. But as I went to thrift shops, I noticed, and as many of you all notice, when you walk into a thrift shop, what do you see? Mostly, you see clothing. 80 to 85% of the entire thrift shop is clothing. If I'm not selling clothing, then I'm missing out on 85% of the potential profits. So, with that in mind, of course, it's easy to get clothing, but again, to sell it, that's another story, and to sell it profitable, that's another story altogether. So I began to make it my life's journey, my life's work, my mission, if you will, to, learn men's clothing. And I started with, men's fashion, current men's fashion, and then I worked up to what would be considered, vintage clothing. And the problem with vintage clothing is anyone can find it, anyone can recognize it, but understanding the value and whether or not a particular piece is worth anything, that's where the true skill comes in. Now, as I said, I have sold to Hollywood, I've sold to Broadway, major movie stars, I've sold to, just to name a few, Kanye West, Tony Hawk. We sold a lot of pieces to Riverdale, if any of you guys watch that. I've sold to Zac Efron. I mean, the list goes on, guys, but I'm not trying to drop names. But then again, I'm just trying to let you guys know that these people do come to me for a reason, and that's because I am the foremost expert on men's vintage clothing. Probably in America, I would venture to say on the planet. I'm sure there are guys out there, and I know a few who actually are very well versed in vintage clothing. They mainly specialize in a particular era or a particular style of vintage. Personally, having sold hundreds of thousands of pieces of individual clothing, I have the experience of being able to understand vintage clothing from A to Z. In other words, from the 1920s, 1910s, all the way to the 1800s, guys. I mean, fashion goes way, way back. But of course, we're not selling pieces from the 1700s, 18th century. If you find something like that, you're definitely going to recognize it. And it belongs in a museum, and that's where most of that stuff is. But the pieces that you will find on a regular or on a semi-regular, or things that are available to you, are going to range from about the oldest, maybe the 1920s, and they're going to go all the way up to our current time. And what most people are selling now, and they say vintage clothing, they're selling vintage t-shirts from the 80s. Now technically I guess that is vintage clothing, but again guys, we can't all sell vintage t-shirts from the 80s. It's not enough quantity to go around, and as we all know, they're not making any more of it. Secret number one, how to identify true vintage. Now, there's only one way to do this. You need to know the era and the authenticity of the item. So like I said, anyone can find something old, but knowing whether or not it's worth anything and what era it's from, that's where the skill comes in, and that's what's going to put ultimately, make the individual item valuable. And depending on the value is going to depend on many factors, like I said, the era and the style. So that is to say, a piece from, let's just say the 50s, for instance, it might scream, this is from the 50s. There could be another piece from the 50s as well, but you look at it and you have no idea where that item, what era that item was manufactured or made. And that is because in our style, in our fashion is subjective, and certain things are hot and certain things are not. So in order to know whether or not something is valuable, like I said, let's just stick with the 50s here for the moment. In the 50s, the stylings that were very hot, in other words, the style that screamed 50s was, the men's suit. Now, a men's suit was classic for the time, and it was very desirable. And the reason why is because if you wore a men's suit, well, not to mention, most people were wearing men's suits. Most men were wearing men's suits. Now, of course, there were exceptions. People who couldn't afford a nice suit, people who had no interest in wearing a suit. Plus, you had your greasers and slickers, and those guys. I mean, let's stick with that. So let's say, if you were a greaser back in the 50s, what would you wear? Well, the iconic greaser outfit, so to speak, would be a white T-shirt. You'd wear a black leather jacket, maybe a brown one, a pair of denim blue jean pants with cuffed at the hem, and maybe you got a pack of cigarettes rolled up in your sleeve here on your white T-shirt, and then you got your hair all slicked back with grease, Now, on the other end of the spectrum, the suits, like I said, suits were very desirable, and now the outfit that I just described to you actually screams the 1950s, right? Now, the suits for the time, the hottest suits, the suits that would scream the 1950s, so to speak, would be a form-fitting men's suit. It would be nice and slick. It would fit nice and smooth to the body, sort of contour and taper in at the waist, so as to appear slim. And most guys were actually slim back then. The majority of people were slim back then, hence the suits did fit slim and form-fitting. And another reason the suits would be short-waisted. They didn't come, way down to almost to your knees like they did in the 40s and the 30s. And there's a reason for that. In other words, in the 40s, suits they had very broad shoulders. All suits have shoulder pads, and that is to give a little bit of intimidation factor, is to make men appear more formidable. But in the 40s, suits were bigger, they were baggier, the zoot suits of the era, the big baggy pants. And the reason why is because material was expensive back then. I believe it was wool in particular was very expensive at the time. And the more, it was actually rationed because of the war. Everything was in short supply. Manufacturing was, people were being pulled off of manufacturing lines, making clothes, so to speak. And and women in particular, when we were being put into work in the ammo shops, basically, that's right. They were making ammunition for the war. So, it became more difficult to get suits. They cost more money. And the more fabric that you had on your suit, that was basically a way to floss, if you want to put it that way. Look how much extra fabric I have. All this extra fabric costs extra money. So then when the wars and all that were going on and the 50s rolled around, we were rationing, and it became sort of a gaudy thing to flaunt, basically flaunting and using more than is necessary. So the suits went to more form-fitting, less fabric, hence the suits where, there's much fabric on them. They fit closer to the body, they fit slim, they looked good. And if you want to, dive into that subject altogether, those suits from the 1950s are even hot and in style now. Now, the style has sort of faded and waned and waxed, throughout the years. The 50s, suits in the 40s were really big in the 80s, and they are back again. Mainly the styling of today is reminiscent from the 50s. But like I said, I digress. I could talk about this all day, guys. I'm going to stay on track here. The 50s suits, and the way that you would identify any particular suit from the 50s are many ways. Number one, back then, silk was king, basically, silk and wool. This was before polyester. This was before a lot of synthetic fibers. In the 20s, maybe in the 30s and 40s, there was a synthetic, considered semi-synthetic, and that was acetate. There were a lot of acetate ties, and that was basically it was a cheaper form of silk. If you couldn't afford silk, you could afford acetate, and acetate sort of mimics silk. The only drawback with it was it wrinkled very badly. It wasn't nearly as resilient. You couldn't iron it. Don't even touch it with an iron. Although many people say you can't iron silk, you can if you know what you're doing. But the suits for the 1950s, the nicest suits were silk and wool. You could get a blend of silk and wool. And the hottest at the time were called sharkskin suits. And that was it was a silk suit, had a nice slick sheen to it, almost a metallic look. And that was to give the man sort of the appearance of almost like wearing armor. You know, back in the day, men wore armor when they went into battle. And it was the same thing. These guys, you ever watch Mad Men? Any of you older cats know Mad Men, the show. And those guys in that, you know, the suits that they wore, that was their armor. That was their suit of armor. So they went into battle. They were daily going into battle, into the business world. And business was, you know, a lot different back then. The corporate business world was young at the time. So these guys were the gladiators, the knights of their time. So they would wear suits with a metallic sort of look. The neckties might have a metallic sheen to them. That look still carries over today. You see a lot of neckties with a metallic sheen to them, and that's where that comes from. That gives a more standoffish vibe. That gives a more intimidating look, as opposed to something like, say, a soft wool herringbone jacket that maybe a psychologist or a shrink might wear to appear more approachable. In other words, that soft material is soft, it's touchable. You look at the silk, these sharkskin suits, that sort of standoffish, don't touch. I'm here to intimidate. I'm here to rule the room. I'm here to take, you know, control of the situation, and hence the sharkskin suit. It fit very slick, looked very nice. It's still one of my favorites to this day. And like I said, that is pretty much the styling that's going on today, is a 50s style suit. The pants would be straight cut, tapered at the bottom actually. They might have a little more room in the waist, but they would be tapered towards the bottom. Typically you'd have a little cuff at the bottom, and they would, you know, wear them a little shorter as they do now. At the time, you know, shoes at the time would be a nice pair of Oxfords, you know, a brogue Oxford, maybe black or brown, or cordovan. Cordovan was very big. It still is. These classic styles, guys, they carry on forever. The classics never go out of style. So just to give you a little insight, you know, that's what was going on in the 50s. That's what was hot in the 50s. And in the 60s, every era carried its particular styles depending on the group of people who was being styled. The group of people, there were beatniks in the 60s, there were hippies in the 70s. You know, you got skaters in the 80s and the 90s. You got the goths that came around in the 90s, headbangers in the 90s when they carried. All these styles carry on, but like I said, for any particular group of people, they have their own style. The way to judge whether something is valuable or not is knowing the eras, knowing the styles. Have you ever looked in your grandpa's closet or maybe your grandmother's and wondered what particular era that suit was from, or that jacket or that shirt or any particular piece of clothing? If it was actually vintage or not? Have you ever found something while you were out there shopping and wondered if this was true vintage or not? Well, there are many ways to tell, not the least of which is the craftsmanship, guys. A lot of, you know, items from back in the day were made by hand. There was a lot more attention given to detail. Things were higher quality. Hence the reason vintage clothing are worth a lot today even. And another reason that they're still around is because they were made to higher standards. You can look at the stitching, guys, on older, you know, vintage clothing. You can look at the stitching and you can see, you know, how straight it is. You can see basically the durability, like I said, the attention to detail. You can check the linings of any particular like men's sport coat or blazer or suit, and you can see the lining in them. You know, you can see the way that they're sewn in. You can feel the fabric. And you can just feel and see the difference. This comes with experience, and it comes over time. You're not going to be able to just look at something from, you know, the 60s and know that it's from the 60s, and look at something from today. You might not even see the difference. But I can promise you, if you take a nice quality vintage piece and you compare it to something that was made today, that's maybe not top quality, even something from the earlier days, you know, that wasn't top, is going to beat something today of high quality. You know, it might be a low quality item from the past, it stands up to a high quality item of today. So, you know, that's the thing. You know, things were made with much more attention to detail back in the day. And that's just one way that you will know whether or not something is true vintage. Now, in the 50s, there were a lot of, you know, high quality brand names going around. Just to give you guys a little insight to what you might want to look for that particular era, a lot of brand names that were hot. Brooks Brothers, you know, has been around for a very long time. If you can find, you know, Brooks Brothers suits from the 50s, those are highly sought after. They were top quality back then. They were expensive then, you know, because they're top quality, and they're still worth a lot today. Jansen is a good brand name, sort of a sport brand. They also made, you know, shirts. You find a lot of Jansen shirts with the short coat, little button cuffs on the side. Arrow was another good brand name. These are still sought after today. Pendleton is a good brand name. They make, if you don't know Pendleton, they're still around today. They make wool items. The red plaid Pendleton with the loop button collar, I mean, those are hot. Those are worth a lot of cash. The problem with those particular shirts is, when you get them, 9 times out of 10, they have moth holes in them. To find one that doesn't have moth holes is going to really increase the value. Florsheim shoes, a shell cordovan leather, from back in the day, those are worth a lot of money. And if any of you are wondering, cordovan, shell cordovan, the most highly sought after, for you to find from back in the 1950s would be a nice pair of Brooks Brothers shell cordovan, Florsheim, shell cordovan. And shell cordovan is basically the rear area of the horse hide. And that's what they would use because it was one large piece and it was the highest quality piece of skin from the horse. And they would use that to make shoes. So if you can find those, those are worth a lot of cash now, especially depending on the condition. And if you do find a pair of those, don't try to polish them. Just a little pro tip for you, Don't try to polish them. You're going to ruin them. Shell cordovan has to be polished in a very particular fashion. You got to use a antler bone, I believe it's called, and a very special particular process if you want to, make those shoes really shine and look their best. So don't try to polish them. Just give them a good clean. You might want to saddle soak them if you can. Give them a little spit shine. Take them to a shoe shop and make sure that they're reputable and they know what they're doing. I'll give you a couple more guys. Hickey Freeman was a good brand. They made a lot of suits. They still make suits, some of the best suits in the business. And what else we got? Gant. Gant's another good brand name. Again, they made shirts, and sportswear. Button downs were their specialty. So if you can find a Gant, that's another, good sought after piece from the 1950s. Back a couple of years ago, 2022, there was a movie come out. It was called Extremely Vile and Wicked. Man, I can never remember the name of this show. And the movie is about Ted Bundy. And it was made for Netflix. And Netflix reached out to me and they were looking for a jacket for Zach to wear in the movie. And, they ended up buying one of my jackets. It was it almost looked like a corduroy, like a wide corduroy, but it wasn't. It was it was like a polyester cotton mix, I believe. This movie was set in the 70s, when Ted Bundy, or maybe it was the 80s. It was set in that time, when Ted Bundy, the killer, killed all these people and everything. And I did sell them this particular jacket. And you can look in the movie and you watch the movie and you can see him in the scene as he's going up the porch. He's walking his girlfriend to the door. He's wearing the jacket. That is the only time that the jacket appears in the movie. Like I said, I've sold it to countless movie stars and foreign dignitaries, movie studios, Broadway shows. I sell to Apple, Netflix, guys, you name it. These guys all come to me and they've been coming to me for years, and there's a good reason for that. And that's why I'm making these videos now, guys, is to pass along this knowledge. One day I'll be gone. I mean, I'm going to be around hopefully for a little while longer. I'm 49, so I'm going to be here for another hot minute. But I would like to pass this on to the next generation. Hence, that's what these videos are going to be about. I'm going to be making more of these videos in the coming day. So if you like these videos, make sure you drop that in the comments and let me know that you want more of them. Don't turn the video off. I'm not done. I still have a lot to tell you guys. But like I said, just let me know what you would like to see, what you would like me to cover in the future pertaining to men's vintage fashion and clothing. So where can you find these vintage pieces? I know that's the big question. That's what everyone wants to know. Where can you find, valuable vintage pieces for your collection? Where can you find the right pieces of vintage clothing for your movies, for your actors, for the studios? I mean, you costume designers out there. How do you know who you can trust? Number one, how do you know what's authentic? How do you know what to look for, in other words, from any particular era or for any costume designer, or what you're looking for, any particular style? So the best place to find these pieces, now what I would recommend, there are 2 sites, guys, and there's 2 sites. It starts with eBay and ends with Etsy. Those are the 2 sites, in my opinion. If you're looking for authentic vintage, the best on the planet, that's where you go. That's where the best items you're going to find are available. And depending on your budget, there's going to be something there for everyone's budget. And the good thing about eBay and Etsy is because there's so many sellers and so many people are sourcing these items and they're bringing them and trying to sell them, that you can be very competitive in your pricing. The pricing is going to be very competitive, and that's going to work in your favor as a buyer, as a costume designer, as a collector, as a vintage clothing aficionado. So whether you're trying to build your personal collection or whether you're looking for that piece to fit your budget for the movie or the play or whatever it is you got, whatever you're working on, guys, eBay and Etsy. Seek out reputable sellers. Check out their stores. Ask them questions. Ask them questions that only someone in the business would know. Check their inventory. That's the easiest way. See what that kind of inventory they have. You can check their feedbacks, of course. That's going to tell you a lot about them. You can also, if you don't want to go on Etsy or eBay, because you are going to pay more, you're going to pay a premium because these people, they're experts in their field. They've researched the item. They went out, they found it. They listed it. They pictured it. They're storing it. They know all about it. They told you all about it. They've checked it over very well for any sorts of holes or any blemishes or anything that could be wrong with it. So with that in mind, of course you're going to pay a little more. So if you're on a budget, I would definitely recommend thrift shops. Now, it's harder to find. It's getting harder and harder to find vintage pieces because there's so many people in the business and because so many people are into vintage now. Everyone wears vintage clothing now. It's hot. Even the brand new clothing that you buy has vintage styling to it. Retro styling, everyone wants it. And the reason being is because they're not making any more of it. It has character. As we got into later times and, our recent days and times, after, say, maybe 2000, things started to lose their flavor, is what I like to say, Everything sort of became, cookie cutter. No one wants to go too much this way or that way. In the day, you had all these wild styles and colors. And fashion was just different back then. I know where I'm going with this. You can still find vintage clothing in the thrift shops. Check your thrift shops. You'll find it in there. Another really good place to find vintage clothing is at estate sales. I find a lot of vintage clothing at estate sales. And an old guy dies, some old dude kicks the bucket, and no disrespect intended, but to you old guys out there, but and their grandpa's clothing is up for grabs. And 9 times out of 10, the children and grandchildren in charge of the estate, they don't want to mess with those clothes. They're not going to try to look them up and see what they're worth and list them individually on eBay, try to maximize their profits. They're just going to, have an estate sale and people are going to come in, they're going to buy all that stuff right out of the closet. So go to estate sales, guys. That's a treasure trove. Another place is you can go on Craigslist, guys. You can buy locally. Again, people who don't have big estate sales or they have an estate sale, they have leftover clothing, they're selling on Craigslist locally. You can find it on there. So there are many places, and again, you can even find, very good deals on pieces on eBay and Etsy. You just got to be willing. You got to kind of wheel and deal those people. You got to put in your offers. You got to, try to work them down a little bit. You got to shop around. Sometimes you just have to wait it out. In other words, if your budget only allows X amount of dollars and you can't find this particular piece that you really want, or you're trying to complete your ensemble or your collection, or you need it for the movie or the show or whatever it is, you might have to just wait it out, guys. In other words, do your search, put in notifications for any particular search so you'll be notified whenever those come up, and you just wait until the particular right one comes up. And, many times a really good item will come up and it'll come up at a good price, but it's gone like that. And the reason why is because it's a good price. So these are just a few places where you can find, good deals, where you can find authentic vintage clothing. Now, when looking for these particular pieces, what you need to, if you're looking for, a particular piece from the 50s or the 60s or the 70s, know your era, guys, know your era. So if you're looking for something from the 70s, then you need to know, first of all, what you're looking for. You need to have something in mind, because you don't want to just put in 1970s clothing or shirt and search, because there's gonna be thousands, hundreds of thousands of items. You're gonna be sort of wandering around. In other words, let's say you're hunting ducks, right? And as a bunch of ducks fly by, you don't just shoot into the sky and hope you hit one. You pick one and you shoot it. And it's the same way with vintage clothing. You don't just go in and browse unless you're just looking for nothing in particular. You find out what you want. You decide on the fabric. You need to know, what fabric is authentic from the 70s. Now, you costume designers, this is mainly who I'm speaking to, guys. If you're looking for something, say for for your play or for your movie or for, whatever it is you're doing, and you need something, got an alarm going off in the background there, it'll go away. But if you're looking for something like I said, from the 70s, you want it to scream 70s, guys. You don't want to get something from the 70s that looks like it's from the 50s. It needs to be style specific. And the way that you're going to know that is the material, the craftsmanship, the quality, the drape, the fit of the clothing. All these things you need to know, guys. So, do your research. What would be classic from the 70s, depending on what you're looking for. Maybe if there's a car salesman from the 70s, you want a plaid suit. It could be wool. If this guy had a little cash, it would be a nice wool suit. If it doesn't have so much cash, it's probably polyester. But it would be plaid. It's going to be dark colors. It's going to be rustic. It's going to be brown. It might be orange. There were ugly colors back then, guys. Earth tones. Think earth tones. Again, you need to know what colors you're looking for. You need to, you don't want to get the wrong color, the wrong style. On the other end, you could just get a brown suit, a brown polyester suit, with a big, thick polyester tie, and maybe a mustard undershirt, with a big pointy collars, and maybe not too big. You don't want something that doesn't fit. You don't want a big butterfly collar because that doesn't go with the suit. But again, you need to familiarize yourself so that you know what you're looking for, so that you know what you're getting is authentic. Number two, you don't want to buy something that's listed from the 70s and you get it and it's from the 50s. And then you put that on, it comes in and you put that on your character or your actor, and you look ridiculous because it's not specific to the time. And hopefully these videos that I will be putting out will help you out in that aspect. So what do you think about this, guys? Has this been helpful to you? Hopefully it has. If it has, make sure you drop that in the comment section and let me know in particular what helped you out. And I would love to hear from some of you guys, what are the most valuable vintage items that you have found in the wild? That's what I like to hear, guys. I like to hear stories of things that I've been found in the wild. And that is to say, when you catch it on eBay, it's already bagged and tagged for you. That's like going to the meat market. In other words, you didn't go out there and hunt that in the wild. So when you go on eBay, that's not finding anything in the wild. Now, there's an exception to that. And I do this, I still do it to this day. You can find items on eBay that are very valuable, but are very inexpensive. And that has a lot to do with the experience level of the seller, how many sales they've made. A lot of sellers might have something really valuable, but they can't sell it. And, in other words, I've bought items from people. I've paid $25 for items on eBay that have been listed to the world. I bring them in, list them in my store, and sell them for $400 or $500. And that has to do with, I know what I'm doing. It has to do with my clientele, as well as, eBay shows me love, guys. I've been selling on their site for 20 years. So in other words, when I list something, eBay's giving me top billing because they know I'm the expert in the field, and they're going to offer up my item to more interested buyers versus this guy doesn't have as many feedback. So, you can find, if you found something on eBay and you sold it for a big high dollar after that, tell me about that. I like to hear those stories too. But I'm really interested in those things you caught in the wild. How much did you pay for it? What'd you sell it for? Or what'd you keep it for, guys? Really, this video is not for resellers so much, although this will help you resellers out. This is for vintage lovers, aficionados, costume designers, and the likes. Now in the upcoming videos, I'm going to be diving into vintage shoes, guys. We're going to be getting really specific. How to identify vintage clothing from any different particular area. We're going to be covering the 50s, the 40s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, all the way up, guys. I'm covering it all. I am giving away all my secrets, all my knowledge, what's taken me 20 plus years to accumulate, guys. I'm going to be giving in the coming days, and hopefully, like I said, to pass on, to help you guys out, to help you build that collection, to help you do your job more effectively, costume designers, collectors, and all the likes. So make sure you tune in for the upcoming videos. Thanks for joining me today, guys. If you haven't subscribed already, make sure you hit that subscribe button and hit the little bell notification to be notified of my latest drops. I'm glad you tuned in today for this journey into men's vintage fashion. Hopefully you'll be here for the upcoming videos. Like I said, hit that subscribe if you want to know when the next ones are coming out, and I will see you in the next video.